All right, guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Maddie here, and it's Tuesday. Typically on Tuesdays, we do tier lists. However, yesterday we actually didn't upload a video. It was Memorial Day. Normally we do Meta Mondays on Monday, where we talk about the Ursa Days Pocket Weekly from the past weekend, and then we go into our tier list on Tuesdays. This week, it's going to be a little bit different. Not only was there not actually an Ursa Days tournament this weekend for us to talk about, but the new expansion is also coming up in just a couple of days, so the metagame is about to change dramatically. So in this video, what I wanted to do was actually do a couple of different things. First and foremost, we're going to talk about the differences and the similarities and the contrast between tournament meta and online competitions in Pokemon Pocket and the in-game ranked battles and the battle system, like the in-game, Master Ball kind of tier. That's the one thing I really do want to cover in this video. And then after that, we're going to go into the results of a couple of smaller tournaments that happened over the past week. I know it's the end of the metagame and some people aren't necessarily super, interested in what decks are the best since, the ranked season is over and, we're going to be getting a new format soon, but it's still really relevant. The real ones out there know that you definitely want to have a good understanding of the metagame at the end of it. That way you kind of know where we're kind of jumping from when we go into the new metagame. So we will take a look at the results from a couple of smaller tournaments that were, about 300-400 players. Definitely good data and interesting data to take a look at. And then after that, to finish up the video, we're going to talk about the format as a whole and why I believe that this was, in fact, the greatest format and the greatest metagame in Pokemon TCG Pocket history. I really do believe that. All right, guys, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Stay tuned for all of the content that's going to be coming up. Thursday is when, ED Crisis releases is what I'm calling this set, the new mini set. It's going to be really great. The meta's going to change a lot. A bunch of new cards and a bunch of new decks. It's going to be a great time. So you're going to want to stay tuned for all of those videos starting Thursday. But for now, guys, let's dive into this week's sort of Meta Monday, but it's Tuesday, so it's not Meta Monday, but it's also not a real Meta Monday anyway. It's actually just sort of a season ending, a format ending, meta review. I don't know what you would call it anyway. Let's get right into it. So the first thing that we're going to talk about today is, of course, the difference between ranked battles and, online tournament competitions. I think that the reason I want to talk about this was because on my Discord for the last couple of days, people have been kind of talking about this, and it's been a point of contention really throughout this entire format in the entire month. And ranked battles are over now, of course, but I think a lot of people over the last couple of weeks were putting sort of the idea out there that, reviewing the tournament data and the decks that people were playing in online competitions wasn't that relevant, I guess is what they were thinking, towards ranked battles. And they were saying that the same decks that you would play in tournaments weren't good in ranked battles and vice versa, which to me doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And that's what we're going to talk about specifically. So first and foremost, I guess we'll just talk about the idea that, decks that you would play or do well in tournaments aren't the same decks that you would play or do well with in ranked battles. And that definitely, to me, isn't necessarily true. Now, the deck lists might change a little bit. I know that there's some idea that maybe some of those hand disruption cards like Red Card or Mars are more valuable in tournaments than they are in ranked battles or vice versa. One thing that I will say that the difference between the two is that it's open deck lists when you're playing in tournaments. So when you match up against an opponent in an online competition, you know what cards are in their deck. Now, that really isn't that big of a deal because I think that most people kind of play very similar lists, and in ranked battles and in tournament, most people are kind of playing the same archetype that other people are playing, and it's only a 20-card deck list in Pokemon Pocket, so there's not a lot of tech inclusions. I guess it can matter for very specific scenarios to know if your opponent is playing Mars or playing Red Card. You might, of course, sort of, play a little bit differently in those scenarios. Maybe you're going up against a Giratina and Darkrai EX player, and of course, as soon as you see the Dark Energies in the Giratina or the Darkrai come down, you know what deck your opponent's playing, whether you can see their deck list or not, but maybe you want to know if they're playing Kamala or not. So there's some differences between those two formats, knowing exactly what cards your opponent's running and what they aren't running. And that's a little bit different, but to be fair, I don't think it's really that big of a difference in terms of deciding what decks you play or what cards in your deck you're going to be playing. I think if you take a look at all of the decks that saw a lot of play in the ranked mode, and in like the Master Ball rank or an Ultra Ball or whatever, and then you took a look at the decks that were doing well in tournaments that people were playing and winning, there's going to be a massive contrast between the two. I think that most people, go to, the Limitless platform, or they go to like other websites, or they watch people on YouTube, talk about deck lists that won tournaments or did well in competitive play, and then they kind of bring those into ranked battles, right? Now, again, other than those few differences that we sort of talked about, I think that people are just a little bit confused overall about the differences between tournaments in the ranked mode, because the formats are different in terms of how they are structured, of course, but the decks are all of the same. Like, they're all the same decks, right? No one's going to be like, oh, Solgaleo and Skarmory, as we can see here on the screen, by the way, And this is going to be the meta results for the entire format. Nobody's going to take a look at Solgaleo and Skarmory having by far the lowest average win rate, that is, across all of the most played decks of the format, and think, oh no, this is actually like a really great deck to play in ranked battles, even though it's not doing well in tournaments. I mean, it's going to be fairly much the same in terms of its results and its overall quality in ranked battles as it will be in tournaments, right? Solgaleo and Skarmory is a totally fine deck, but as we see across all of the other most common decks of the format, it just underperforms, right? It saw a lot more play early on. It was a top 3 deck early on and then kind of fell off and not many people played it. But, you know, in my experience playing 500, 600, 700 games of ranked battles and most of those games in Master Ball rank, I can tell you that Solgaleo was not a deck that I saw very commonly. And I think that a big reason for that was because it just really wasn't a quality deck. And in the same vein, a lot of the decks that we see here at the top of the tournament metagame here on the Limitless platform are all probably going to be some of the most common decks that you'll see in Master Ball rank. And again, people that have played ranked battles exclusively or extensively, I should say, will probably also see a lot of similarities. Now, the win rates here are another sort of point in contention, right? Like you can take a look at something like Giratina and Darkrai having a 53% win rate across this overall format with 1,700 players or people playing it. And again, this is a large sample size here for this particular format over the last month here. This is 14,000 players and 34,000 matches. So this is a large sample size. Giratina and Darkrai went almost 5,000 wins and 4,000 losses, right? So that's fairly decent. Again, a 53% win rate. This was certainly the most played deck of the format, but was also a top deck of the format. And I think if you were to take a look at the ranked battles metagame, in whether it was Ultra Ball or Master Ball rank, you'll probably see that Giratina and Darkrai was certainly a really good choice for ranked battles as well. And all of these other decks, whether it was Giratina and Greninja with Tapu, Lele, or Snorlax, Meowscarada and Decidueye, which rose towards the end of the format, Arceus and Crobat, whether that was, again, with Carnivine or not, Garchomp, Charizard, Greninja Oricorio, Magnezone Oricorio, Greninja and Giratina, again, it's split up in Limitless, but either way, all of the Rampardos decks, Turtonator, these were all of the decks that you saw in ranked battles. So, again, I don't agree. I really just don't. I don't flat out agree that the results, or I guess the data that we have from online competitions doesn't translate well to ranked battles. In fact, I think it translates quite well, in fact. And I think that players who utilize the data that we showcase on our channel, or just utilize really deck lists that they find doing well in tournaments, probably are going to have an advantage in ranked battles. And again, you can take a look at all of the highest rating players in this ranked season, the people that played the most and won the most, had the best ratings. They were all playing decks, I guarantee you, they were all playing decks that had at least some relevancy in the tournament metagame. Now, one thing that we'll talk about later when we talk about how great of a metagame this was and how great of a format this was how spread out it was. Of course, the meta shares are always going to be a little bit lopsided, right? Giratina and Darkrai was about 12% of the meta share, whereas like something like, Greninja and Oricorio was only about 4.5%. But if you take a look at the meta shares, it's actually very, very, very spread out, considering what we've seen in previous formats, and the win rates are also very spread out. And if you take a look right here at the top 5 decks of the format, they were all floating between 52 to like 53%, which is a very, very like finite difference, right? If you really think about it, and there's 5 different decks right here just in the top 5 that were all 5% or more of the meta share and had a 52 or plus % win rate, which is definitely really, really, really good. And if you go down too, we also see that there's still a ton of other decks that had good win rates and saw plenty of play. Solgaleo is a bit of an outlier. It was almost 5% of the meta share, but was pretty bad on the win rate side, about 47.5%, which really isn't that terrible if you really think about it. But anyway, that's kind of the main outlier. And then if we go down again, like Greninja Oricorio is really common, Magnezone Oricorio, those are very common decks, both floating around 50% win rates in tournaments. Greninja and Giratina, again, down here at 51%. We also had the Lucario decks, Charizard Turtonator, Lycanroc, Giratina Magnezone, which is one thing that we'll talk about, definitely rose in popularity towards the end of this format. That's why this is a kind of significant outlier, only just about over 1% of the meta share. That's because it was a relatively new deck and it didn't pop up until the last week, which we'll talk about. But a 55% win rate over this last week, which is really phenomenal, right? So it's honestly a kind of a top deck that kind of swooped in towards the later end of things. But yeah, I think that people that are kind of assuming that tournament decks aren't relevant towards ranked battles, and I know that a lot of you guys probably aren't, don't agree with that, but some of people have been talking about that, and that's why I wanted to cover it here on the channel, is that I just don't agree with it. Now, to be fair, we can't actually dispute that fact, like like completely, because we don't have access to any actual data to prove our point, right? So for the people that are saying like, oh, you know, ranked battle decks are different than tournament decks, like I disagree, but we don't have any actual like metadata or like actual just sort of proof of that, because there's no data for ranked battles. We don't get anything like that like we do on Limitless. So the only data sets that we have available to us when we're making a decision as to what cards we should play, what decks we should play, and what their matchups are, the only way and the only like categorical data that we have to determine any of that stuff is from the tournament meta, and we don't have anything from like a ranked battles perspective to categorize it. But one thing I will say is that if we did have ranked battle data, I guarantee you it would look very, very similar to the overall tournament metadata that we've gotten over the last month. I guarantee you it would be very, very, very similar. Now, again, I think that a big part of the confusion with tournaments is that, you know, people take a look at the deck lists that win tournaments, and then they kind of make their assumptions based off of like whatever deck got first place. And then they're like, oh, like, is this the best deck in the game right now? That's really not how it works. If you take a look at the results from like last week's tournament, which I don't have pulled up right now, but if you can remember from last weekend, not this one that just happened, but the one before that, the last time there was the Arceus tournament, which was the largest tournament of all time, almost 3,000 players. Magnezone and Oricorio won that tournament. But again, it was not a deck that was played very much, and it didn't have a great like overall win rate throughout that tournament. So, you know, somebody might take a look at the results from that tournament and say, okay, Magnezone and Oricorio was the best deck in the game, or the best deck to play right now. But if you actually kind of dove a little bit deeper into the data from that tournament, you'd see that it was actually Meowscarada and Decidueye that had a far and away the best sort of results from that tournament. And at that time, Meowscarada and Decidueye was really good against a lot of the other top decks in the format. Fighting was very, very common still, and all of these Giratina decks were very common. And Meowscarada specifically was really good against all of those matchups when paired again with the Decidueye. And that's why it kind of rose up to be the number 3 deck of this format with a really, really solid win rate. It dominated that Arceus tournament 2 weeks ago. But it didn't win the tournament. It got, I think, like second place and third place, but it lost to Magnezone and Oricorio. And again, we talked about this in the last Meta Monday. We talked about how, yes, Magnezone and Oricorio did win the tournament, but the most successful deck of that tournament overall was, in fact, Meowscarada and Decidueye. So I think that a lot of the people maybe kind of misconstruing the data that we pull from the tournament results in our Meta Mondays and in our tournament reports. And I really do urge people to look a little bit deeper than just the decks that are kind of placing really high in the tournament. There's a much greater story. A lot of times, day 2 is like 64 or 128 different decks. So it's a whole different ball game, right? What I would say is that if you're gonna take a look at like a current snapshot in the metagame of that week, which is of course like the Arceus tournament, right? Is a great way that we do that every week. What you probably should take a look at is just like the day 1 data, because the day 1 is all Swiss rounds. So the opponents are very much spread out. It's not single elimination or anything like that. So the day 1 tournament data is probably like the best, I guess, example that we have that relates directly to like ranked battles. And then once you get into a tournament bracket and it's single elimination, it's all about sort of meta calls and like how positioned your deck is against the specific matchups that you hit, which is again why Magnezone and Oricorio won that tournament, even though Meowscarada and Decidueye had, I think it was like the meta share for the overall tournament for grass that week was about like 10 or 11%, but its distribution in day 2 was like 27%. So it jumped up massively. It had an incredible day 1 performance. And that's because against the field of decks that people were playing that weekend, it was very well positioned and it did really well. So again, it's all different. It's different in terms of like how we can kind of pull the data from, but I strongly urge people to look past whatever deck like gets first place, because like the assumption I think a lot of people have is that, oh, this deck won, so this is the deck I should be playing. That's really not the case. Typically in tournaments, the decks that win or place really high are decks that are strong against like the decks that do well in the tournament, right? And again, in that particular tournament scenario, the vast majority of decks that made top cut in day 2 of the 128 decks, it was predominantly like Giratina Darkrai, Giratina Tapu Lele, and then Meowscarada. And Meowscarada did really well against those other decks. But then there was a couple, I think there was like 2 Magnezone and Oricorio decks that just ended up kind of farming all of those other decks in day 2 because they didn't have to play against a lot of the decks that it wasn't good against. It was just really specifically good against Meowscarada and Decidueye and pretty good against Giratina Darkrai. One player in particular got pretty lucky playing mostly all Meowscarada and just sort of ended up winning the tournament. So that's kind of how that went. But anyway, we're definitely rambling on a little bit. My point being is that I think that there's a clear determination and I guess a correlation is the main difference, right? And I talk about this kind of all the time in the Discord, is the difference between correlation and causation, right? Like just because a deck does well in tournaments doesn't mean that it's going to be a great deck in ranked battles, but we can certainly make a correlation that the decks that do well in tournament play are also decks that are good to play in ranked battles. So you got to keep that in mind. Now, one thing I will say is that this format was very much a little bit different from last format, in the sense that we had about 5 to 10 different decks that were all really, really good choices and totally fine choices, whether it was tournament play or in ranked battles. And again, if you take a look at the decks that won the large tournaments over this entire format, week 1 was Giratina and Snorlax, week 2 was Giratina and Tapu Lele, and then week 3, which was last largest tournament a couple weekends ago, was Magnezone and Oricorio. And to be fair, those are 3 different decks, and Snorlax was actually really common and was actually really well positioned early on in the format, and then fell out of favor, especially when Tapu Lele saw more play, and then Tapu Lele ended up winning, and then the week after that, when Meowscarada saw more play, Magnezone and Oricorio won. So there you go. Also, if you kind of think back to yesterday's tier list, or last week's tier list, sorry, I did put Magnezone and Oricorio in the S tier, and some people thought I was crazy for doing that. It did get first place at the tournament, but the reason why I put Magnezone and Oricorio in the S tier of last week's tier list was actually because I thought it was just in general like the most well-positioned deck, given the top decks and the most popular decks of the format. Grass was on the rise, fighting was definitely on the decline because grass was on the rise, and the Giratina decks were all really, really common. So Magnezone specifically has been phenomenal over the last week. In fact, but it's actually been played and not just with Oricorio. So I put Magnezone and Oricorio in the S tier of last week's tier list because at that time, Magnezone and Giratina wasn't actually a deck list yet. So if it was a deck list, it probably would have deserved an S tier spot, but it wasn't even seeing play. But I don't think it's any surprise that Magnezone ended up being probably the most successful deck of the past week, right after we kind of ranked it in the S tier. It just was played not only with Oricorio, it was played with Giratina, but a big reason why I put it in the S tier last week in the tier list was because of Magnezone, and not necessarily like the Magnezone or Oricorio deck in general. It was just Magnezone and how well positioned it was, which again, as we've seen, and what we will see here soon, is that it was by far, I would say, the most successful deck of the last week or so. But anyway, guys, there it is. There's my rant. We're going to open up the video with a massive rant talking about, like I said, the differences and similarities between ranked battles and tournament data. I'm just going to leave you guys on this one fact, and I know some people maybe skipped through this realistically because this is kind of a long rant that we're opening the video on. But truthfully, this is the only data that we have. So if you want to be somebody that completely just sort of neglects to, I guess, analyze all of the tournament meta and all of the actual data that we have available to us, you're going to be putting yourself at a disadvantage. Sure, there's going to be some differences between tournaments and ranked mode data and which decks you should be playing, but they're going to correlate very, very accurately between the two. And I think if that you're not, I guess, utilizing the data that we showcase on the channel basically every day, you're going to be putting yourself at a pretty distinct advantage. And one thing I will say is that I do my best to not be biased, to just sort of look at the data, look at the numbers, and then give accurate estimations as to what decks I believe are the best decks to play based off of the data. And even though that data is, again, based on the tournament metagame, it's going to translate very, very well to ranked battles. And again, I really do believe that. So there you go, guys. There's my rant. Sorry that was so long. And I know some people, feel free to comment below and let me know. And if you want to disagree or agree with me, that's totally fine. But again, I think it really comes down to the fact that we don't have ranked battle data. So like, even if you disagree with the fact that there is a strong correlation between the two, that's fine. You have no data in which you can back that claim up. So I can't necessarily dispute that claim, but I'm going to go ahead and rely on the only real data that we have available to us, which I strongly believe will give us an advantage both in tournaments, of course, but also in ranked battles. Okay, anyway, rant is over. Okay, let's move on to a couple of tournaments that were really, I think, kind of surprising, but also still really relevant to look at over the last week. Now, again, not many people might be that interested to take a look at a couple of tournaments over the last week because, again, the format is wrapping up, so we don't have, the next Ursa Days tournament this coming weekend will be in a new metagame right after ED Crisis releases. I can't get over the name, ED Crisis. So some people might not think that it's that relevant to take a look at the results of the last weekend, but I strongly recommend that you go ahead and you spend some time taking a look at it because I think that next format is going to be actually very similar to this format. There's certainly going to be a couple wrenches thrown in there with some of the new cards and the Ultra Beasts, but you're definitely going to want to have a good understanding of, what's going on at the end of this format as we go into the next format. So let's take a look here at the Frog EX Weekly Cup that happened about 4 or 5 days ago now, early last week. And this was the results. These were the deck lists that did the best, or I guess ranked the highest in that tournament. Again, about 400 players. The next tournament we'll take a look at here is going to be the MST tournament that happened over the weekend. Again, about 400 players into it. So this was the #1 placing deck list of the Frog EX Weekly tournament a couple days ago, or 3-4 days ago, and this is Magnezone, Tapu Lele, and Giratina. Now, at the end of last week, I did kind of specifically talk about this deck in terms of what I believed was the best deck to play to kind of follow up and finish your ranked battles climb, right? And a big reason for that was because this really kind of emerged as a top deck. And we don't normally talk about the smaller tournaments, and we kind of do our meta reports on Monday, but a lot changes between Mondays, so that's sort of where that Friday video kind of fills in, and that's why I talked about this deck so much on Friday. If you took a look at the metagame overall, you would see that there was really two particular pairings, or I guess strategies, that were doing better than mostly every other deck in the format. Most significantly, I would say it was the Giratina Tapu Lele combination. Most commonly, people play this combo with Greninja, and they would play a couple copies of Cyrus, and the deck strategy was really all about building up Giratina because we were playing Psychic Energies in the deck, which, by the way, this deck is also playing Psychic Energies. We'd build up our Giratina, we'd have Tapu Lele in the active spot, and then we'd kind of pick and choose which Pokemon on our opponent's board we wanted to target down and do some damage to with Energy Arrow. And then even if they KO Tapu Lele, we could go into Giratina, KO whatever Pokemon we wanted to because it had damage onto it already. We could bring it up with Cyrus, and then we would kind of sweep our opponent that way. We also had Greninja to back it up. Now, this deck list, instead of Greninja, has been playing Magnezone, which is the other strategy that I think has been doing so well really over the last couple of weeks, and that's because Meowscarada has kind of risen as a top contender in the format right now, and Magnezone is specifically really good against Meowscarada. So this is a great way to play that really strong Tapu Lele Giratina Psychic combination. Again, playing Psychic Energies in the deck, we can double attach to Giratina, get it set up in just a couple of turns. We can also utilize Tapu Lele, which itself is an incredibly strong Pokemon, but on the back end, to deal specifically with that grass matchups, but also against Oricorio, we have Magnezone. So it really is kind of the best of both worlds. And Magnezone itself, again, independent from the rest of the deck because Magneton can accelerate those electric energies. Even if we are playing exclusively Psychic Energies in the deck list, which we are, then we have two Pokemon that are kind of independently building up their own energies and can attack specifically. Now, what oftentimes does happen with this deck, which is incredible, is that if Tapu Lele leads, we can, again, spend a couple of turns Broken Space bellowing, but also at that same time building up Magnezone so that once we attack maybe once or twice with Tapu Lele and Tapu Lele goes down, we can even take a KO with Magnezone with that 110 damage, and then we even have another attack if we can live, and we have 140 HP with Giant Cape, that's 160. Not a lot of Pokemon are able to KO us, specifically against those Meowscarada decks, so Magnezone was kind of that in-between buffer, but going between Tapu Lele and Giratina, and if your opponent has to deal with that Tapu Lele, which again is kind of doing damage to specific Pokemon that we want to target, and then they have to go through Magnezone, and then after Magnezone they also have to go through Giratina, it's just too much for most decks to handle. And this deck may seem kind of inconsistent at first glance, but it really isn't. You got to understand that Tapu Lele and Giratina are both basic Pokemon that are really useful and consistently out on your board early on. And then again, Magnemite, Magneton, and Magnezone, those are evolution Pokemon, but we don't have to draw them like super quickly, right? I mean, it doesn't really matter if Magnezone gets set up until turn 3, turn 4, even turn 5 sometimes, because a lot of the opponents that we're going up against probably don't really have much to do or won't be doing much in the first like 2 or 3 turns, maybe even 4 turns anyway. So it's a deck list that actually flows a lot better than you might think, and it's actually a lot more consistent than you might think. And we are playing, again, 10 Pokemon in the deck, which is quite a bit, more than most other decks in the format. But most decks are also playing 2 Rare Candy and not playing the middle evolution, so it's really not that different than like the Greninja deck, which was playing 8 Pokemon and then playing 2 Rare Candies. Instead of Rare Candy, we're just playing Magneton. But again, it doesn't really matter if Magnezone gets evolved on our first couple of turns, because it's not a Pokemon we're using early on anyway. So that's the upside with Magnezone. Specifically really good against that Meowscarada combination that was seeing a lot of play and still sees a lot of play in the format. And then we have the Tapu Lele Greninja core, which again is just one of the best combinations in the entire game. And then we had room for research, Mars, Cyrus, Guzma, Sabrina, and even Pokemon Center Lady with Giant Cape and Pokeball. So really everything that you need in a deck list. This deck kind of did it all and was, I would say, as well positioned against really the top of the metagame as any other deck was over the last few days. Now, as we see here in the results, Meowscarada and Decidueye did get 2nd place and 3rd place, just like the Ursa Days tournament. Didn't end up getting the win, got kind of snubbed out because of Magnezone, but this is still definitely a really, really top deck. Shout out to these Brazilian players, by the way, for doing really well in this tournament. And yeah, I think that Meowscarada with Decidueye is one of the strongest decks in the game. I talked about this deck kind of like a lot over the last couple of weeks. I thought it was always really good, but Fire just saw a lot of play early on. And for whatever the reason, Fire just kind of like kept grass out of the format pretty, solidly, I would say. But then, the fire decks definitely declined in play, and grass was certainly a lot more well-positioned against the other top decks of the format. Meowscarada is really, really good, again, with the Ericas, with the Lilies, with the Leaf Capes. Ton of HP. Going to be really good against Giratina, against Darkrai, but was also good against Oricorio. So it was kind of used specifically in that scenario. Not many counters to it other than the fire Pokemon. Also, it's really strong against the fighting type decks, right? We can live a hit from Rampardos. We can also hit Garchomp for weakness. And then we have Decidueye as well, which is just an incredible Pokemon. So this was a deck that did kind of struggle against like the Charizard fire decks. But because Charizard and the other fire decks declined in play a little bit, Meowscarada rose up. It was really good against all of the other popular decks of the format. And I think it will continue to do so. We'll talk about it probably in tomorrow's video, kind of where we think that, where I believe a lot of the deck lists that are popular in the format now will maybe go, and what will happen to them, how they'll change. We'll talk about that in tomorrow's video, sort of a prospective deck list sort of analysis, given all of the new cards that are coming out. But for now, yeah, Meowscarada Decidueye was certainly a top deck of the format. And it kind of, I would say, ended up top 3, not only in Metashare, as we saw from the overall data statistics, but was certainly a top 3 deck in the last week or so for sure. And then as we go down, we see some other kind of interesting contenders. Here is going to be that Greninja, Tapu, Lele, Giratina combination. Again, very similar to Magnezone. I think that Greninja really kind of fits well with this particular strategy. And it's probably a little bit better like on paper. But again, if you're going up against a ton of Meowscarada decks, then you kind of get beat by those decks anyway, right? So the whole point of Magnezone was to sort of fit it into this particular strategy that, in my mind, kind of was the top deck of this format, or certainly one of them. Instead of kind of leaning directly into the strategy, we kind of split it down the middle and played Magnezone specifically to counter the grass matchup and have a little bit of a better time as well against Oricorio. But this deck is phenomenal. It really is so good. It's just a ton of additional bench damage, tons of flexibility. We can set up Giratina, again, playing probably just Psychic Energies in this deck. However, you could also play Water, but I would recommend playing Psychic Energies. And then, yeah, it just kind of was very, very dominant, specifically really good against Giratina and Darkrai, but was pretty strong against really the entire field. Unfortunately, though, grass rose in popularity, kind of probably because of this deck list, and then, Magnezone kind of countered it. But anyway, a very, very strong deck that has been doing well really for the last 3 weeks, ever since it won the Ursa Days tournament like 2 or 3 weeks ago. And then Gallade. Gallade's a really interesting one. I did mention it, again, last week on my best decks for ranks video. Gallade kind of rose to be probably the best fighting type deck option. I think that Rampardos is an incredible option. It's also pretty good. It actually wins the head-to-head matchup against Meowscarada, mainly just because Meowscarada doesn't do the full damage. It only hits for 60, but that's actually 80 for weakness. But again, we have Lily, so we can live 2 hits from Meowscarada, and Rampardos does a lot of damage to Meowscarada, 130, right? But Gallade, the thing with Gallade is that it's not weak to grass, right? So you can play a really strong EX Pokemon that can survive quite a long time, again, with Giant Cape and Lilies, with all of that healing and extra HP, but we're not weak to grass, which means that we don't get absolutely scared out of the format by things like Meowscarada and Decidueye. So again, at the end of the format in this last week or so, where the grass decks were so common, the fighting Rampardos combination was still really good, so people wanted to play it, and Gallade kind of really fit that bill. I do think that Garchomp is kind of a better Pokemon than Gallade, but if grass is seeing play everywhere, Garchomp is weak to grass, so I do think that Gallade is definitely a better option into the metagame currently, or at least it was over the last week, than Garchomp was, which is why it kind of rose in popularity. And a big reason why it did so well, and also getting 5th in this tournament, is kind of no surprise. And then we also have the kind of newer version of Arceus and Crobat that we kind of saw play. And again, I also talked about this last Friday before the ranked season ended. And this is going to be the Arceus Crobat combo, but instead of playing Grass Energies and playing Carnivine, we're just playing Dark Energies, and we're playing the Darkrai and Giratina combo. So again, another mashup deck, very similar to the Giratina, Tapu Lele, and Magnezone deck, which kind of matched together 2 other archetypes. This is also a mashup between, Arceus Crobat and then Darkrai Giratina. You kind of just throw them all together, and they kind of fit pretty well together in a way that is a little bit interesting. Now, the only downside to this particular deck is that, again, we also aren't doing really well against the Meowscarada decks, but it is incredibly strong if the deck kind of flows properly, if we do get all 3 of our Arceus, Darkrai, and Giratina out. No matter which one's in the active spot and we do get a Crobat on our bench, it's just a ton of damage, a ton of extra damage. Giratina Darkrai can win games in its own right. And the cool thing about Giratina is that we can play it in dark decks, as we've seen with Giratina and Darkrai, and it just kind of does its own thing, right? So this is a deck that can go a bunch of different directions. It's strong really no matter kind of what happens. One thing I will say, though, is that it probably isn't the most consistent deck in the world, but in the same vein, we're playing Dark Energy, so we can attack with both Crobat, Darkrai, Arceus, and Giratina, right? So it's a really, really strong deck. saw a ton of play over the last week or so, and it's interesting to me that that's kind of what the format really ended up being after some time, was really just kind of mash up decks. I think that people realized that playing decks that were just good into particular matchups was a bit more valuable than being a little bit more consistent. And there's certainly some cards that are a bit more flexible in the way that we can play them than other cards. Things like Magnezone are very, very flexible. And then, of course, Arceus and Crobat was also kind of flexible because it was a bit independent from everything else, and you could just pair it with the Darkrai Giratina combo. So, yeah, it was interesting to me that the two kind of decks that rose in popularity at the end of this format were just mashups of two different archetypes that kind of fit together somewhat well and really kind of opened up your matchup spreads against a wider variety of decks in the format, which I, again, thought was definitely really, really interesting. So this was the results from the Frog EX Weekly Cup. Let's fast forward over here to the other tournament of just a couple of days ago, actually, which was the MST and you Pancho King of the Hill $100 tournament. I don't know what that name means per se, but this was also a really relevant tournament. Kind of filled the place a little bit of Ursa Days this weekend. Again, I had about 300-400 players playing in it, and this was the results. Again, just a couple of days ago was when this tournament wrapped up. And yeah, as we see here, Giratina and Magnezone doing pretty well, but also Magnezone or Choreo, just tons of Magnezone throughout the entire results here. And then a couple of Arceus decks, which did get first place, went 9-0, but also got third place here at 7-1. So let's take a look here. And again, this is going to be very similar to that other deck that we saw. In fact, it's probably kind of the exact same. We could also play Dawn in this list too, which is definitely an upside because Crobat does have free retreat. So there are scenarios where maybe we just get Crobat out early and it's in the active spot, which is certainly really good, but it retreats for free. So if we retreat Crobat to the bench, whether it's into Darkrai or Arceus or even Giratina, we can play that Dawn and move that energy back to the new active Pokemon and attack a turn earlier. That's certainly definitely really, really good and upside for this deck list for sure. But yeah, here it is. This is an example. So in the other tournament, as we saw, Giratina and Magnezone got first place, but in this tournament, it was actually the Dark Arceus Giratina and Darkrai deck that got first place. The difference here is that we are playing 2 copies of Giratina, and I don't know exactly what else the differences were, but yeah, very, very similar deck, and again, just a really, really strong deck. People were calling it like the Thanos deck because it just had a bunch of really strong pieces, and if they all kind of came together in a correct way, then you just ended up winning because it was just so inherently strong. Again, also one of the top decks, I think, at the end of this format. So interesting to see that this deck got first place in this tournament. A ranker from the Netherlands, but also Evan D here from Mexico was also playing Giratina and Magnezone. So again, we can kind of see this across the board. This deck list is a bit different. It's playing red instead of Guzma. That's a really interesting point of contention as it comes to like this entire format. Guzma definitely took over the spot of red in most deck lists, and I do kind of think that Guzma is certainly better in the format now with Meowscarada seeing so much play with Leaf Cape than red is, but you also got to take a look at some specific matchups because against that matchup, Magnezone kind of handles things, right? So red is really, really good against, I think, particularly against kind of like those EX basic Pokemon that still see play but have a little bit more HP than what we are able to deal with things like Magnezone or even Giratina. So Magnezone does 110, but with red against an EX Pokemon, that's 130. And that is enough to KO things like Darkrai, Giratina, Magnezone sometimes. So, or Arceus sometimes, which is definitely pretty relevant, especially after 20 or 40 damage done by Tapu Lele. But also 150 with Giratina is enough to take KOs as well. So I would say that when you're playing Magnezone in this particular deck, red might even be better than Guzma, but in most other decks, I would say Guzma is definitely better, right? Guzma is certainly, I think, overall better because Meowscarada saw so much play over the last week or so, and it's one of the most popular decks, but Magnezone does just really good against Meowscarada anyway, and we're going to just live no matter what. So I think that playing red in Magnezone is actually kind of better, which is an interesting thing to note for sure. 2 Magnezones getting second and third place here, and then we had another Arceus and Crobat deck. So the reason this one is categorized differently is because we're actually playing Carnivine. So the traditional like Crobat Arceus toolbox deck is still really good. Still seeing a lot of play and a lot of success, but I think a lot of people have just swapped over from this version, which is playing Grass Energies, to the Dark version, which is playing Giratina and Darkrai EX. They're all still really good. I just think that this particular deck in general, I think, kind of got carried a bit by Carnivine. I think that especially early on in the format and against a lot of these Stage 2 decks that had a lot of these basic Pokemon, Carnivine just was really, really good because you always could pop off and do 50 damage on your first turn going second. And it was just a little bit too much for most decks to deal with, especially if they didn't get the evolution off on their second or third turn, which again does happen sometimes. So I think that the data from this deck list particularly was kind of inflated, basically due to the fact that Carnivine was just so strong in the scenarios where you did draw it. Also kind of a Thanos deck, where you just sort of like you either get all of the cards the way you want them and you win, or you just don't and then you lose, and it kind of feels bad. So it's certainly one of those types of decks, but still a top deck, I think, of the format over the last week or so. Top 5, I would say, for sure. And then if we go down, we still see, again, what place was this right here? So this is the player here from Spain got 5th place, and that was with, of course, still Greninja and Tapu, Lele, and Giratina. Again, I think inherently this might be the best deck of this format right now, but the positioning has changed around pretty dramatically. I just think that Magnezone kind of clears this deck because, sure, Greninja is a bit better, but there's no guarantee that you're going to get Greninja out, and Magnezone can one-hit KO Greninja and Tapu Lele, so you do have a little bit of an advantage in that matchup, but overall, I think this deck list is still super, super phenomenal. And I think that kind of leads us into the idea that we're going to end this video on, which, if we go back to the overall I guess metadata from this format, is that this was really, in my mind, the best format, the best metagame that we've ever had in Pokemon Pocket. Some people might not agree with me, and I think that the people that wouldn't agree with me might be the people that I guess really are the type of players that enjoy kind of playing like one deck that is at the top of the metagame and then, you know, getting really good at it and just having a really high win rate. Last season, it was certainly easier to have a much higher win rate, whether it was in tournaments or in ranked battles, than this particular format in this season. And I know some people might not think that that's a good thing, but it really is in terms of the health of the game and the overall distribution of which decks were good. If you take a look at this data, guys, I mean, like truthfully, like if you compare this to all of the other previous formats in Pokemon Pocket, it's massively spread out. By far the most spread out format that we've had in the history of Pokemon Pocket. You could really say that any week, at any given time of this last month of this metagame and of this format, there was probably 4, 5, 6 decks that you could play that were kind of all like S tier material. I know in the tier lists we kind of were a little bit picky and we would kind of put maybe 1 or 2 decks in S tier every week, but I really do feel like there was a lot of different decks that found their way to the top of like a tier list throughout the entire format. And things changed a ton as well. If you take a look at how things were in the first week, and then the format kind of came into its own in the second and third week, and then really kind of broke open in this last week, which again is kind of what we're talking about this week with Magnezone and Giratina, but also the Dark Arceus deck. Just a completely wide open format. Now, there's going to be some outliers for decks that just truly weren't that good that did see play. Again, I do think that Solgaleo and Skarmory is kind of the one outlier. It was, I think, the most played deck of the first week. It was super hyped up, but just didn't ever do that well. It never placed very well, never had a great win rate, and never really won, I don't think, any large competitions. And that's, you know, we can get into that, but I just think that Solgaleo as a card is probably a totally fine card, but I just don't think that Skarmory was a great pairing with it. And in general, I just don't know if it was as good of a card as it maybe needed to be. But Solgaleo certainly might kind of rise back up in popularity because I think it's a totally fine card. I just don't know if it was, I just don't think the format was like that kind to it in general. Also, like a lot of these like stage 2 EX Pokemon were playing Lily in their deck. So oftentimes like doing 120 like 2 turns in a row with Solgaleo wasn't even enough to take the KO. So 120 was a bit of an awkward number for sure, but definitely a strong card. Just wasn't nearly as well performing as a lot of the other decks in the metagame. But whether we're talking about sort of the 3 or 4 different Giratina decks that were at the top of the metagame at some point throughout this format, whether that was, of course, Giratina and Darkrai, or whether that was any of the Giratina and Greninja variants, whether that was with Snorlax or Oricorio or Tapu Lele, those all saw a lot of play and a lot of success throughout the tournament. Limitless, or throughout the format, Limitless categorized them in a kind of an unfortunate way. For whatever the reason, we never had like proper metadata for those particular decks. So it's a bit unfortunate, but I guess, you know, we have Giratina and Greninja, which kind of fits all of the bill for all of those, but certainly a very, very good deck. And again, all of those decks, when you combine them, were certainly, I guess, the second most played deck of the format. But if you go down, there was also Greninja and Giratina. I think this is the exact same thing as up here, except this is the decks where people were playing like at least 1 copy of Frogadier in the deck, which just changed the way that Limitless categorized the decks. Realistically, right here at the number 2 spot, Giratina and Greninja, as well as at the number 10 spot, Greninja and Giratina, these are the same deck. So if you combine them, it actually probably was, yeah, it was actually the most played archetype of the format. It just really was like 2 or 3 different archetypes split into one. So that's probably why. But all of those decks were top tier decks. And then even the Oricorio Greninja deck, which either saw play with Giratina or some other variant at some point, was also a really, really strong deck. It only had a 50.5% win rate, but I certainly think that early on this deck was absolutely insane. I just think that the format kind of shifted away or shifted towards countering Oricorio more than it didn't for the majority of the format, which is, you know, fair. I think that Oricorio is certainly an interesting Pokemon, which I guess we'll take a look at in a little bit. Even Magnezone Oricorio, which was just about 50% win rate, was the 9th most played deck of the format. Meowscarada and Decidueye saw a ton of play in the last couple of weeks, but ended up being the 3rd most played deck at also a really good win rate. Arceus and Crobat was sort of the dark horse of the format. Never won a large tournament, but always won a bunch of smaller tournaments and had a great win rate. Again, 52.5%. Garchomp was a great player this tournament, or this format. One of my favorite decks. One of the, in general, I think the best decks of the format. And if Meowscarada wasn't a deck that saw a lot of play, and didn't end up being one of the most played decks of the format, I really think that Garchomp Rampardos had an opportunity to be a top tier deck. There was a week, I think, in there where I almost put it in the S tier because I thought it was just so good. And it is really that good. A really, really high win rate. I mean, 52.5%, even with all of the Meowscarada seeing play, is really, really phenomenal. Charizard and Incineroar. Now, all of the Charizard decks, in my mind, were always a bit underwhelming. People kind of called me out for being biased, negatively biased towards the fire decks. But when I took a look at the data every week and the results, this was a deck that I think always saw more play than I think it deserved. And I do really like the Charizard decks, and I think that there was certainly a moment in time there, especially right after Meowscarada did so well a couple of weeks ago, that I thought playing some of these Charizard decks was actually a really smart decision. So for me, for it to be like the 6th most played deck of the format and to have just about a 50% win rate is probably fair. I think it was a really decent deck, but I don't know if it really deserved to be a top 5 deck of the format, which is probably why, I'm glad at least that it wasn't a top 5 deck. But we also had Charizard and Turtonator, which was sort of the Charizard deck that was less good than Charizard and Incineroar, but of course was much better against Oricorio. So I think that's really where Charizard Turtonator came in. Also a really great deck of the format. Lycanroc. This was something that I always tiered a little bit lower, but was certainly a decently fine deck. It was good against Oricorio, but at the same time, like Lycanroc in general, I think was just a little bit underwhelming. And I think that Lucario was actually just a better Pokemon, especially to pair with Rampardos. So in my mind, I always had Lucario Rampardos tiered a little bit higher than Lycanroc personally. But any of the Rampardos decks were really, really good. And I think that they were actually really important inclusions in the metagame. And then Garchomp. Look at Garchomp, though. Like, Garchomp really was, like, so good. I mean, there wasn't really a time ever in the format where Garchomp wasn't a great option. It was something that I think I recommended week after week after week in terms of my choices for which decks to play for ranked battles. I think the only reason I swapped Garchomp for Gallade towards the end there was because of the rise in Meowscarada. But Garchomp was an incredible deck of this format. Love to see it kind of find its way into the top 5 there for Metashare. But yeah, I mean, all of these decks, I mean, you could take a look at really everything like right here, I would say is kind of really where that cutoff begins to happen. Like 12 decks, I would say, that were all kind of totally viable. Maybe Sans Solgaleo, so maybe that's 11 decks. But then if we go down, we can take a look at some decks that saw a lot of play later on. Like Gallade ended up being a really good choice later on in the format. And I also think that Togekiss was a dark horse here at literally a 50% win rate. But yeah, Giratina Magnezone, right, came in later on the line as well. And I think if we go down, we'll probably also see, yeah, Giratina and Arceus here as well, right, at a 53% win rate over the last kind of week or so. Only 55 people played it in tournaments over the last couple of weeks, but that's because it was a new archetype as well. So realistically, if you take a look at the entire metagame, there was probably about, 10 to 15 different decks that you could all like kind of put into like a really high tier, like A tier and above decks, which is something that we've never seen before and something that I thought was really, really healthy for the metagame. And that's a big reason why I kind of think that this was the best meta of all time. Feel free to comment below if you disagree, if you agree. I would love to hear your thoughts about this overall meta, what you thought of it. What about the ranked season, about tournaments, everything. I would love to hear you guys' opinions. I'm a bit sad that we're going into a new metagame, but I also do think that the next format with ED Crisis releasing and the Ultra Beasts is actually just going to build upon the great format that we had already over the last month. And I guess if we kind of look back and we think to ourselves, maybe why was this format so good? I think it kind of came down to 2 cards that are definitely kind of points of contention amongst the player base, but I think were 2 different cards that were extremely good for the overall health of Pokemon Pocket, and that was Rare Candy and Oricorio. Both of these cards have upsides and downsides when you take a look at their impact on the overall metagame. Let's go ahead. I'm just going to pull these cards up while I talk about them. First of all, let's talk about Oricorio. because Oricorio as a card was certainly very, very interesting. Oricorio, of course, being immune to all attacks and damage from EX Pokemon made it a bit of a strategy that was really annoying to go up against, and it certainly created a lot of scenarios where you just weren't able to play the game. But what it did do was it created a different atmosphere in the format in the way that people were building their deck lists. If you take a look at all of the previous formats, or at least the last like 2 or 3 previous formats, anything that was Giratina Darkrai or even like Dialga and Arceus, those are decks that were playing exclusively basic EX Pokemon, and they dominated the metagame. So Oricorio kind of threw a wrench in all that and said, listen, if you want to play these inherently really consistent, strong decks that rely entirely on basic EX Pokemon, you have to make your deck even a little bit less consistent or a little bit less good to play maybe some other Pokemon that at least can counter Oricorio. And we did see that to some degree. Of course, Charizard had Turtonator. Giratina Darkrai had Kamala. Those are cards that kind of inherently made the deck worse, but made it, of course, winnable in the Oricorio matchup. So Oricorio did that, but the one thing that Oricorio did was kind of force people to find the best middle ground, which is really what we saw oftentimes in the format. Oricorio as well was actually paired in a variety of different decks, which I think is healthy. I don't think there was just one Oricorio deck, which is always really good. You could pair it with Greninja, or you could pair it with Magnezone. So it did see play in a variety of different deck lists. So hopefully we maybe even get some more decks and strategies that work well with Oricorio. But yeah, what Oricorio did was it kind of opened up the format in multiple different ways so that most decks and most of the top decks of the format found a really good middle ground. That's a big reason why I think Giratina and Snorlax won early on in the format, was because it really was kind of the best of both worlds. And then later on, that evolved into like Tapu Lele Giratina, which was kind of, I would just say, kind of a better version of Snorlax. And the big reason why that deck list was so good was because you were able to kind of play the Giratina strategy, which was inherently the strongest Pokemon in the game, but we found a way to pair it with other non-EX Pokemon that were really, really good. And the best ways to do that ended up kind of being with Tapu Lele and Greninja. So Oricorio kind of forced the hand of a lot of the top meta decks to kind of shift and be a little bit more diverse in how they were built. And I think that was actually really, really good for the metagame. The other thing that we talk about all the time was that Oricorio split things down like into 3 ways, where the format, I've said this a bunch of times, the format used to be split into like 2 different categories, which was the inherently best decks in the game, and then there was the few decks that were really good against those top decks, right? For an example, like last format, I believe we had, what was it? I think Giratina Darkrai dominated last format, right? So that was like, realistically, there was a couple other decks last format, but for the most part, you could kind of chalk the entire last metagame down to Giratina Darkrai, and then we had Gyarados, which was inherently like less good than Giratina Darkrai, but it was better, it was good against Giratina Darkrai. So especially at the top of the metagame, whether it was tournaments or ranked battles, last format, really all you saw was Giratina and Gyarados, because those were the top decks of their respective kind of categories in the format. Oricorio kind of completely split that down the middle, so now you had the inherently strongest decks, and then you had the Oricorio decks, and then you had the decks that were good against Oricorio. So it opened up the game to like 3 or even more different categories, whereas before it really was just kind of 2 different categories down the middle. And I think that was honestly really healthy for the metagame. So I know a lot of people don't love Oricorio, but I think it was actually a really, really big deal for the health of the game, but also just in general, I think the way that the game was played and the way that people were building decks, which I think was a big reason why the format was much more evenly spread out. The other card that changed the metagame significantly was Rare Candy. And I think that Rare Candy, in hindsight, kind of changed the format in a lot different of a way than we thought it would have. Now, Rare Candy, of course, is really, really good, but the main upside to Rare Candy wasn't that it made stage 2 decks more consistent. I don't think there was one deck at the top of the metagame that was playing both the 2 copies of the middle evolution and 2 copies of Rare Candy. Realistically, what Rare Candy did was allowed us to play a couple other Pokemon with a stage 2 Pokemon that paired nicely with it, and then allowed us to I guess, accelerate those stage 2 decks. So really what I'm trying to say is that all of the Rare Candy stage 2 decks that saw play were in decks where those stage 2 Pokemon had either 1 or 2 energies in its attack cost, because the upside to being able to Rare Candy turn 2 and attack with that stage 2 Pokemon greatly outweighed the upside to just having a more consistent stage 2 Pokemon. So that's kind of what we saw. So Rare Candy did accelerate the format in a way that made a lot of these stage 2 decks really explosive, kind of high roll decks, whereas like you either got Rare Candy and that stage 2 out really early and you were a strong deck, or you never found Rare Candy and you kind of just lost. So it did make a lot of those decks feel a little bit more high-rolly and a little bit less consistent in their overall output of their results. But what it did do is made a lot of those decks relevant. Whereas before, things like Garchomp, things like Gallade, things like Rampardos, even Meowscarada, which, were all decent cards in the format at one point, it made them like good enough to kind of contend at least with other top decks. So the format Charizard is another example of that as well. Decidueye even as well. So I think that rare candy is really important to the game, and I think a big reason why we saw so many decks at least somewhat good in the format was because, yes, we had Giratina Darkrai, and we had those basic Pokemon decks that were super consistent and just really, really good because they were consistent, but they also had to deal with sometimes staring down, a turn 2, Garchomp EX, which was definitely really, really scary for those decks. So it really evened out the playing field for a lot of those stage 2 decks, which either didn't have the consistency or didn't have the pace that they needed to be at the top of the metagame. Rare Candy definitely allowed them to do so, which I think was certainly very, very, very important to how, the metagame kind of evolved over the last few days. So again, I would love to hear your opinions about Oricorio and Rare Candy, but I think those two cards, along with really some of the new Pokemon in the format, although truthfully, there really wasn't a lot of great new Pokemon that came out in the new set. I forget what it's called. What is it called? It's called like Dimensional something. Celestial Guardians. Okay. I honestly forgot off the top of my head. Celestial Guardians was a very interesting stat. A lot of the Pokemon were a bit underwhelming. I would say Oricorio was probably the best card that came out, or the best Pokemon that came out. Decidueye was certainly pretty good. Was there anything else really? Like, I think all of the other Pokemon that were relevant, like Turtonator maybe, Lycanroc kind of, and then Solgaleo and Lunala, but really all of the most prominent Pokemon in the metagame were actually from previous sets. So it really was kind of Oricorio and Rare Candy that really kind of changed things around for the metagame in a way that I think was really, really good. So yeah, anyway, guys, super long video. We started off with a rant, and then we kind of went off the deep end talking about why I thought the format was really good, but yeah, I'm actually kind of sad that the format's over. I am. This was kind of my favorite metagame experience since Pokemon Pocket's been released, and I think that they're kind of getting better and better with things. I know that the sets are coming out every month, and it's a little bit tough for people to keep up with, especially free-to-play players. That's its own content. It's its own topic of debate. Of course, you can kind of share your thoughts about that in the comment section below. But, for the people that, of course, are able to keep up with it and do spend money on the game, the overall competitive nature of the game is certainly really, really good. Even though there is a little bit of a rebound effect early on when the cards are released, that not everybody has the cards and whatnot. But after like 2 or 3 weeks, when things all really settle, I think that the metagames end up really being quite good. And again, I think that Oricorio and Rare Candy were kind of the main reasons why I thought our metagame this time was so good. So I'm a little bit disappointed that this format is over. I'm hoping that next format is also as wide open and fun as this format was. We'll have to see. I know some people aren't really like super high on some of the new cards from the ED Crisis set and the Ultra Beasts, but I do think there's some really, really good cards, definitely some winners coming out in the next set that I think are definitely going to throw a wrench in the current metagame that we have right now. But the upside, though, is that even if they don't shake up the metagame that much, this metagame is certainly not figured out, and things are evolving very, very rapidly. So even if it is just like a little bit of a change towards this current metagame, this meta that we're in right now is still evolving and changing rapidly, so I'm actually excited to see what happens. And yeah, you're going to want to stay tuned because it's going to be a fun week, a fun couple of weeks, and a fun month here on the channel. I'm really, really excited about it. All right, guys. That's it. Again, I apologize for no video yesterday. No tier list this week. No Meta Monday, really. This is kind of the meta report of the week. A bit of a summary as well as a rant and a meta report, all kind of bundled into one. Definitely a long video. We talked a lot in this video. Oh, geez. Tomorrow, I think what we're going to do is talk about the new cards. We might get some data leaks between now and then. We might not, so we'll have to see. We might have to wait for the set to release to get all of the new cards and to see what they are. But either way, tomorrow we're going to talk about some new strategies and new deck ideas that I have for all of the new cards coming in ED Crisis, which should be definitely really fun, so stay tuned for that. And then, of course, Thursday, the set releases, which is where the real fun begins. So you're going to want to stay tuned for that, guys. All right. Peace out. Have a good one. Hopefully you guys, had a great weekend, and hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Like and subscribe, all that good stuff. Comment below. I would love to hear you guys' opinions about everything that we talked about today. And yeah, there it is, guys. All right. Peace out. Have a good one.